The year is 1789. A rabble of Parisian citizens armed with muskets and kitchen knives stormed a Bastille, an event that would change history forever. And in a moment of prescience, Alexis de Tocqueville would write these words about the French Revolution. I know no greater spectacle than that which is presented by a nation of people whose minds are working all in the same direction. Let's start with Plato, the father of Western philosophy. In his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato paints an allegory of the ideal state where philosopher kings rule, guided by reason and wisdom. They, too, feared what would happen when the multitude, that amorphous entity known as the masses, gained too much power. Cicero, the great Roman orator and philosopher, warned that when the mob holds sway, the rule of law can be eroded. Instead, mob justice prevails. The Bhagavad Gita speaks of 4 ages of humanity, each progressively worse than the last. Why do they see the downfall of civilization as coming not from the few, but from the many? One possible answer, and perhaps the most obvious, is that ancient thinkers lived in societies where the masses, though large, were largely powerless. Populist movements often thrive on the promise of giving voice to the voiceless, of championing the cause of the ordinary people. The Roman Stoics like Seneca argued that the truth is not determined by numbers. Wisdom, not majority vote, should guide governance. Seneca famously wrote, "The people are never more bent on destruction than when they are applauding." As we mentioned earlier, ancient texts often depict the crowd as fickle, reactive, and easily incited, capable of elevating a hero one day and executing him the next. This concern wasn't unique to ancient thinkers. Perhaps their greatest insight was understanding that power, regardless of who wields it, corrupts. And perhaps their greatest fear was that the masses, once corrupted, would use their power to destroy not only themselves but the very fabric of society. It echoes in the writings of Revolutionary-era thinkers like Thomas Paine, who argued in Common Sense that a revolution wouldn't succeed solely because of numbers, but because of the principles it espoused. Think of the trial of Socrates, the Greek philosopher, or the crucifixion of Jesus, the Jewish preacher. Both were beloved by their followers, but both were condemned by the masses they once inspired. Such volatility, ancient thinkers believed, was a recipe for instability and disaster. In other words, applause, especially when it comes from the masses, doesn't necessarily mean that what's happening is right or good. The Stoics weren't opposed to the idea of power residing in the hands of the many, they just feared the consequences. The pursuit of individual virtue and happiness, they believed, was incompatible with the volatility of mass politics. Do you think the ancient thinkers were right to fear the masses? Or do you believe that the power of the many is ultimately a force for good? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more engaging historical insights. But ancient thinkers saw through this rhetoric. They knew that such movements could easily spiral into chaos and ruin. The masses, they argued, were not immune to flattery or manipulation. Quite the contrary. They were particularly susceptible to it. They understood that the masses, in their quest for power, could be exploited by charismatic but unscrupulous leaders who fanned the flames of discontent for personal gain. These false leaders, often products of the masses themselves, rise to prominence by stoking fear and resentment among the people, painting themselves as champions of the common man while secretly serving their own interests. The masses, blinded by their own passions, failed to see through this deception, thus setting the stage for a disastrous outcome. Their societies were aristocratic, elitist, and in some ways, undemocratic. Change came from the top down. The idea of grassroots upheaval, of a revolution ignited by the masses, was a radical notion, one that frightened the ruling classes. With mass power, the tendency is towards groupthink, a conformity of thought that stifles dissent and sacrifices individual brilliance for the sake of fitting in. This creates a dangerous situation because those in power become less concerned with finding the right solutions and more concerned with presenting a united front. The result is a flattening of moral nuance and the adoption of policies driven by emotion rather than reason. It threatened the very foundations of their authority. We begin with Satya Yuga, the age of truth, where the masses lived virtuously and righteously. Then comes Treta Yuga, where virtue declined, but the masses still followed the path of righteousness. The third age is called Dvapara Yuga, where only a third of humanity followed Dharma. Finally, we arrive at Kali Yuga, the age of quarrel and strife. Here, only a tenth of humanity follows Dharma. The rest live in darkness, immorality, and illusion. What brings on this dark age? The unrestrained desires of the masses. As it says in the Vishnu Purana, as the fire of sacrifice shall go out in the Kali Yuga, the people shall become addicted to sensual pleasure. This Hindu concept mirrors the Christian idea of the last days, as described in the New Testament. Both speak of a time when human virtue will wane, leading to moral decay and societal breakdown. In his famous treatise on the laws, Cicero writes, "All popular movements must be carefully watched. For what is most dangerous in a republic is that the people," which is a term used to describe the whole body of citizens. Ancient thinkers understood something about the nature of power, something we still grapple with today. They understood that power tends to corrupt, and that once the masses acquire power, they may not wield it as wisely or as justly as they intend. Why is this? Because the masses are susceptible to manipulation, to empty promises of redistribution or reform. They can be swayed by the most base emotions, by fear, anger, envy, or ambition. Ancient thinkers recognized that the masses lacked the wisdom and restraint of the elite. They feared that the masses, once in power, would make decisions based on emotion rather than reason. That they would elect leaders who promised to serve their interests, but who might betray them once in office, should desire to act as a whole in its corporate capacity. Because in such cases, the very nature of the Constitution is at stake. For if the multitude of the people, which means the common folk, by acclamation and in a body makes a decision on any matter, this does not happen by the force of a majority, but by the force of faction. Here, Cicero hits upon something crucial. The danger lies not in the majority as such, but in the faction within the majority. The organized, the ambitious minority that can manipulate the masses to seize power and subvert the existing social order. But he also examines the downfall of such a state, which happens when the masses gain control. His vision of an ideal society was one marked by hierarchy and harmony. The ruler was the son of heaven, virtuous and wise. Below him were scholars, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Each had their place. What Confucius feared was the destruction of this order, not by an elite few, but by the many, by the masses who rebelled against their betters. When this happens, he says, the people no longer follow the right way, so it goes from bad to worse. There is such conduct among them that there is no king or lord who can put it right. Thus, good men are like banished from the empire, while the empire is falling into ruin. Confucius wasn't afraid of a powerful few imposing their will on the many. He feared the many taking the law into their own hands, imposing their will on others, destroying the very fabric of society in the process. In Book 8 of the Republic, Plato writes, "When the poor, outnumbering the rich, become masters of the state, the latter are driven by force to exile or civil war." Why does this happen? Because according to Plato, the masses value two things above all else: freedom and equality. He defines freedom in the context of self-governance. Freedom for Plato means everyone can make laws, but the problem is that when everyone makes laws, there are no laws. He warns that this freedom quickly becomes license, descending into mob rule, where might is right. And so the many who are passionate and impulsive will come to dominate the few who are rational and wise. The result is demagoguery. Plato calls it oligarchy. It is a corruption of democracy where the rule of the people becomes the tyranny of the majority, who take the same part in the same opinions and have the same destiny. His words hinted at something both intoxicating and terrifying: the potential of the masses. Today we're going to explore why some of the most brilliant minds throughout history feared mass power. But Plato isn't alone. Aristotle, his student, shared many of his mentor's fears. He, too, identified the pitfalls of democracy. He says that democracies tend to fall prey to populist appeals. The majority, motivated by passion or envy rather than virtue or wisdom, is vulnerable to manipulation. In other words, the masses, driven by their own self-interest, will elect officials who cater to their desires, not necessarily those who govern in the best interest of the state. This populist impulse, Aristotle argues, ultimately undermines the very foundations of a prosperous and stable society. In the Roman Republic, The Stoics and other philosophers shared similar concerns. Confucius, the sage of China, echoed these sentiments. In ancient India, the concept of the decline of the masses is embedded in the Hindu epic poem, the Mahabharata. Let's pause here for a moment. You might be thinking, why do so many theories, regardless of geography or time, converge on this point? But there's another possible answer, an answer that gets to the heart of the matter. So let's talk now about populism and how ancient thinkers viewed it as a dangerous game. The Stoics took this view to its logical extreme. Ancient thinkers also feared the effect of mass power on the individual mind. And then there's the emotional volatility of the crowd. Finally, there's the fear of revolt, the fear that mass power would lead to the redistribution of land, wealth, or privilege. In the end, the fears of ancient thinkers regarding mass power haven't been entirely alleviated by the passage of time. If you found this video thought-provoking, consider watching our previous video on the lessons history has taught us about life. We'd love to hear your thoughts.